You should never applaud before you've heard what I'm going to say. You may take your applause back. Thank you. It's a privilege to be here and talk to you today briefly about some of the key challenges that I see facing regional security mechanisms in Africa. As you've already heard, I'm an academic. I'm not a practitioner. I'm a curious outsider when it comes to Africa's regional security mechanisms. So the perspective you'll get from me is one of that, a curious academic outsider. I want to raise what I think are 8 important challenges that I think are facing Africa's regional security mechanisms at the moment, focusing particularly on the APSA, the African Peace and Security Institutions. But I want to start with a little bit of context before I briefly elaborate on those 8 challenges. First of all, just where are we now when it comes to peace operations on the continent? I think there's a few key things just to flag up. Firstly, we have to remember, of course, the APSA institutions, although we've been working on them for over a decade, they're still not finished yet. So any judgment about their effectiveness is still tentative. Secondly, we've seen a large increase in the number of peace operations and peacekeepers on the continent. And today, we're now at an all-time record high. Depending how you define peace operations and count peacekeepers, we're now at well over 100,000 uniformed personnel on the African continent, which is a record. Most of those obviously coming from the United Nations, and over 80% of all the UN's peacekeepers worldwide have been deployed in Africa, as you can see there from the top chart, for at least the best part of the last 15 years or so. And there's a couple of other points I want to mention as important context. Although the UN is still the dominant, I would say most important peacekeeping actor on the continent, the UN shouldn't and can't do all things on its own. And really the norm, I think, that's developed is what I would call partnership peacekeeping. That is collaboration between different multilateral institutions and different state bilateral actors. Partnership peacekeeping is really where the game is at, and I think will stay the key focus for the foreseeable future. And the key relationships, I think, there are between 3 multilateral institutions, the United Nations, the African Union, and the European Union in particular, and 2 bilateral countries from outside the continent. That's the United States and France. And I think currently, at least, for our peace operations to work effectively, it's the relationships between the UN, AU, EU, and the US and France that have been particularly important. The other important point to note is that while those peacekeeping numbers have been rising, many of them have been from outside the continent, but actually more and more have been deployed by African states themselves. So it's very important to remember that if we look at what's happened even in just the last 10 years, we're now seeing a deployment of over 60,000 African soldiers and police, and that's a really major development, and in many ways a very positive development over the last decade or so. And finally, although I'll put these up in a bit more detail, these are the 60-odd thousand peacekeepers that the African Union has now authorized since 2003. But leading us into the challenges, I think it's also important to remember that the African Union itself is clearly not always coming to a consensus on these issues. There's a lot of different opinions and different views within the African Union, certainly within the regional economic communities that are sometimes different from the AU. And so this is the point of departure that I want to stress before we get into the challenges. Now, I think these deployments of African peacekeepers, of course, reflect a growing confidence and initiative on the part of African states, but I also don't think they would have been possible without various security and support programs from external actors, as I mentioned, particularly the United States and France. So what I want to do to stimulate some debate, hopefully, is to throw out for you 8 key challenges that I think are currently facing Africa's regional security mechanisms. The first one is related to strategic coordination. As you'll know, the African peace and security architecture there, as I've set it out, is complicated on its own. But for any of the APSA operations to actually work, these institutions can't do it on their own. Instead, they have to work with a number of other organizations. Firstly, obviously, they require support from the African Union Commission in order to get things done. Secondly, they crucially require the support and cooperation of the regional economic communities and the 2 regional mechanisms that were created as part of the African Standby Force. And as you'll know, the latest memorandums of understanding between the African Union and the RECs, we have about 8 key RECs. But it's also more complicated than that. We also need all of Africa's member states to get involved in some way, shape or form. And here, most of the burden when it comes to peace operations has fallen on a relatively small number of African states. It's still about a dozen African countries that provide the vast majority of peacekeepers in these operations. But it's also more complicated than that because we also need support from the United Nations, from the UN Security Council, sometimes for mandates, but also agencies like the UN Office for the African Union in Addis Ababa has played a particularly important role. It's also more complicated than that because when it comes to finance in particular, and as well as some military and police support, we also need the European Union. The AMISOM mission in Somalia certainly wouldn't have functioned if it hadn't have been for the EU paying the allowances of troops. And it's even more complicated than that because we need bilateral partners, and I'm saying particularly the US, France, I should also mention Britain, as you can tell by my accent. But a range of bilateral actors are also important to make the APSA and these missions work. Put all these cogs together in this machine and you can see how strategic coordination is often challenging. Getting all these actors to define the same problems, the same priorities, to define the same instruments to respond, this is not always easy and it rarely works according to plan. So that's challenge number 1. I would say challenge number 2 then is actually the political decision-making process amongst the different African institutions. Who is it that gets to call the shots when we're responding to a particular crisis? Who is the key voice of authority when it comes to responding to a particular challenge in the African continent? Is that key voice of authority located at the African Union, or is it located in one of the regional economic communities that I put up there? Now, I think this is complicated, and partly why it's a challenge is because I still don't think the African Union and the RECs agree on the concept of subsidiarity. And I'm not entirely convinced that there's a complete consensus yet on who's supposed to take charge in a given regional crisis. Is it supposed to lie, in first case, with the regional economic community, or is it supposed to be the African Union that takes the lead? And we've seen, whether you look at Cote d'Ivoire or Central African Republic or Madagascar, we see different interpretations and arguments about who should lead the response. What I think this means is that the challenge is, how does the African Union Peace and Security Council really factor in the opinions and views and perceptions of the regional economic communities? And it's done some things to help that process, but it still, I think, needs more to be done. Challenge number 3 then, I think, is to do with the African Standby Force and trying to achieve full operational capability. Now, what I think we've got here is a story of the ASF on paper, and then the ASF in terms of the reality of deployments to crisis zones in Africa. Now, on paper, the African Standby Force is nearing, I would say nearing at least, completion, in the sense that with the next Amani 2 set of exercises, we're going to be, at least on paper, able to declare full operational capability for a number of the standby forces. Now, in my opinion, it's clear that the North African Regional Force is just nowhere to be seen at all. But then I think you can have different levels of debate, let's say, about how far the ECOWAS region, Southern Africa, East Africa, and Central Africa. So I think by the end of this year, we're probably going to have a situation where 3 or maybe 4 of the regional forces can at least declare on paper full operational capability. I think then we've got a couple of questions, though, and challenges that remain. One is that it's clear that those regional forces lack a whole lot of critical enablers when it comes to strategic lift efforts, logistics, intelligence, mobility assets, particularly if we need armored and protected mobility, helicopters, field hospitals, engineering, and sometimes even special forces. These regional forces still lack a number of these key components. The other challenge I think we face is what role are the ASF regional forces going to play in terms of their longevity? Are they just meant to be sort of short-term rapid response forces that will then hand over to the United Nations, as we've seen in Mali and Central African Republic, or is their role going to be longer term? So I think there's a series of questions about the capabilities of the ASF. The fourth challenge, I think, is then to do with money and who pays for these regional mechanisms. And if you follow the money, what does it tell us about the politics of Africa's regional security mechanisms? So I want to make a few points here. The first point is that obviously within the African Union itself, it's a very uneven sharing of the burden when it comes to finances. And when you look at how the African Union's budgets are funded, both its operating budget, its program budget, but crucially for our purposes, the peace operations budget, we see that the large majority of finance actually comes from external partners. And even within the African Union now, we've had for a long time the big five in Africa playing the major financial role: Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Nigeria, and South Africa. But as we know, after the Arab uprisings in 2011, the North African states had particular problems financing the AU, Libya obviously still in particular. We've now at least got an aspiration from the African Union that Angola will be playing a bigger role in the future when it comes to financing the AU. But this, I think, raises a big and important question. What is the credibility of the rest of the African Union's member states if the financing weighs so heavily on just a few countries' shoulders? The aspiration we have, as you see there, is that the AU wants to fund 100% of its operational budget, 75% of its program budget, but only 25% of its peace operations budget. And if we think of this in absolute terms, the budget for the AMISOM mission in Somalia at the moment is about $900 million each year. So these are the types of figures we're needing to find. You'll know better than me probably that there's been a number of attempts to find more indigenous sources of finance. President Obasanjo's commission there suggested ideas about a hospitality levy, taxing hotel accommodation and stays. Other people have suggested taxing flights, international flights into the continent. There's been arguments about taxing SMS messages. I've even heard recently there's the idea of having a lottery, an African Union lottery system that the proceeds will go to help finance the institution. But to my mind, I think until the African Union's member states can pay more of their own budget to support peace and security activities, it raises big questions, I think, about the credibility of the institutions. It certainly raises issues about local ownership. We know whoever pays the bills will have a large degree of influence over what is done in these missions. And it raises questions about the sustainability of these institutions. What would happen if the European Union decided to stop paying its Africa Peace Facility, or the United States decided to cut its budget in these areas? So there, I think, are a number of challenges around finance. The fifth set of challenges, I think, revolve around what I call gaps between institutional designs and real crises. Now, what I mean by this is that the whole of the African peace and security architecture is really based on quite rigid blueprints and institutions, particularly the ASF standby forces. The problem is, if you look at real crises, and if you think here of the cases of, say, the Tuareg rebellions in northern Mali, or the Boko Haram insurgency in northeastern Nigeria, the problem is that when we have actually real security crises to deal with, they very rarely fit neatly into the regional economic community or institutional frameworks that we've designed. So Mali, for example, there is no sense in which ECOWAS alone could deal or should deal with the Mali crisis. You have to involve Algeria, Morocco, Libya probably, definitely Chad, and other countries outside of ECOWAS. Similarly, even when we're talking about the Boko Haram issue, ECOWAS alone is not able to be the right type of framework here. And if you were to look at Somalia or Central African Republic or other places, you would find this same set of problems. So we need to think about adaptability and flexibility. How do you design institutional frameworks which can adapt when you actually have real crises, which don't map onto those frameworks. And I think related to that, the sixth challenge is to do with our original design scenarios and the original policy framework that was established back in 2003 that set out what the African Standby Force was going to do. Now, as you know here, we have 6 scenarios from Roadmap number 1 back in 2003. The problem or the challenge as I see it is that that original design was really quite military heavy. It was focused primarily on the problem of civil wars, political insurgencies, and the problems that they would generate. I think to some extent that is still true. Of course, Africa is still facing a number of civil wars and what we might call sort of traditional political insurgents that might want to capture state power. But I think if you look at Africa's broader set of security challenges, clearly the military dimension is only one part of this. I would suggest that transnational terror networks have become increasingly important. Environmental issues and environmental degradation are very important if you look at the scope of pastoralist conflicts and other challenges related to water and land issues on the continent. Environmental security issues are becoming much more prominent. Transnational organized crime, whether it's the trafficking of humans, narcotics, animals, small arms and light weapons, whatever the case, I think is playing more and more important roles in the continent. Maritime security issues, or rather maritime insecurity issues, are increasingly prominent as well. And as Ebola reminds us recently, health pandemics. Now, what I think this means is we've got a sort of baseline set of frameworks or policy frameworks for the African peace and security architecture, which are too narrowly focused on military issues and the problems of civil war. And we have to think about how would the ASF and the APSA institutions play a role in these broader set of challenges. And if they can, how would we reform them? And if they can't, what new instruments and institutions do we need? And then seventh challenge is to do with the debate that's happened recently, specifically about the deployment of military peacekeepers in Africa and rapid response to crisis. And this is the debate that we've seen really since the Mali crisis unfolded in 2012 and early 2013, with the creation of the ACERC, the African Capacity for Immediate Response to Crises. And this has thrown out there, I think, 2 different models of crisis response for the African continent. On the one hand, we have the African Standby Force model, based on the 5 regional forces, or as I said earlier, 4, because North Africa is not working yet at all. But we have that idea of regional standby forces based around the RECs. And on the other hand now, we have this idea of ACERC, which is to say, really, is standby and regional forces the best model to adopt? Should we instead move to really coalitions of the willing and think about our operational deployments and responses to crises through coalitions, which can be assembled across the continent for different reasons? Now, as you'll know, again, there's lots of problems that the ASF has with its political decision-making, particularly with Scenario 6, which officially still relies on the AU Assembly. Thank you. But the Peace and Security Council is probably really where we're going to have to make these decisions. So I think we've got to face up, are there challenges about these 2 things? Are they mutually exclusive, or can they be complementary? Now, the official position is obviously that the ACERC is an interim measure until the African Standby Force is completed, and then we won't need ACERC anymore. I don't think that's necessarily going to be easy, because I think, as I said, it raises 2 different models of approach. Is it regional standby forces that are going to be our basis, or is it coalitions of the willing assembled ad hoc? And finally, to finish, I think there's a set of challenges about political will. Even if we assume that we can finish building all of the different APSA institutions and all the different African standby forces and response mechanisms, we still have the question of whether Africa's political leaders will use these instruments. Will they actually decide to deploy their forces in multilateral forums and through multilateral instruments? Or will they continue to deploy, I think, first and foremost, through unilateral means? If you look at East Africa in particular, I would say, Ethiopia's intervention in Somalia, Kenya's intervention in Somalia, Uganda's intervention in South Sudan, Eritrea's intervention into a number of countries. Thank you. All of these things, I think, say to me that many of our African political leaders, they think first and foremost unilaterally, and they think first and foremost about deploying their armies unilaterally. And they only think secondarily, quite a distant second, I think, sometimes, about using these multilateral frameworks. So I think the final challenge is one of political leadership and political will. If we build these institutions, we have to have the political will to use multilateral instruments to respond to security challenges. And I'll stop there.